Why does a woman remain single for so long? The question may seem simple, even trivial to those who have never experienced the depth of silence that inhabits certain nights, or the constant murmur of a "what's wrong with me?" that settles in the mind like a drop falling over and over. But for many women, this question is not just another topic of conversation, nor a passing curiosity. It is a burden, a question that sneaks in moments of intimacy, that activates in front of family members' gaze at gatherings, that feeds on seemingly harmless comments like, "And when will it be your turn?" or "Surely you're just too demanding." In reality, this phenomenon is rarely examined with depth, with the seriousness it deserves, and even less from a perspective that contemplates what Jacobo Grinberg defined as the perceptual construction of reality. In the 21st century, during the peak of female empowerment, access to education, freedom of choice, how can it be explained that so many women, intelligent, loving, independent, remain single for so long? Is it perhaps a choice, a destiny, a social failure? Or is there something more subtle, deeper, that is not being considered? Let's start by looking at the data. According to a global United Nations report, the proportion of single women over 35 years old has increased significantly in the last 30 years. In countries like Japan, Germany, or even the United States, the number of women who neither marry nor have a stable partner before 40 has doubled. In Latin America, the patterns show the same direction, with slight cultural variations. And we're not talking about women who lack options, but women who choose, consciously or not, a life without a formal partner for years, even decades. But why? Superficial explanations tend to focus on phrases like, "She doesn't want to commit," "She has had bad experiences," "She hasn't found her equal," "Men fear successful women." And while all these phrases may contain part of a partial truth, they are insufficient to explain the entire phenomenon. Here is where the thought of Jacobo Grinberg, Mexican neurophysiologist, psychologist, and mystic, appears, who proposed one of the most disruptive theories about how we construct our reality, the synergic model. According to Grinberg, every person lives immersed in a neuronal field that modulates their perception, interpretation of the world, relationships, and ultimately, what happens to them. This field is neither fixed nor objective, but malleable, responding both to our conscious beliefs and the invisible, inherited or implanted ones. That is, what you experience in your life, including your sentimental situation, is not only the product of external factors, but of how your internal perceptual field is structured. In this sense, the prolonged singleness of many women may be less related to what is missing outside and more to what vibrates, hides, or repeats inside. But before continuing to develop this approach, I invite you that if this topic is already resonating with you, if you have ever felt identified with this question, or simply feel the need to look at your story from another angle, subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell, because this video is not a criticism nor a judgment. It is a deep, loving, and revealing exploration. Throughout the video, we will discover together why there are women who, without consciously wanting to, emotionally sabotage themselves, why others repeat relational patterns that lead them to fleeting or painful relationships, and why even among those who deeply wish to share their life with someone, there is something invisible that stops them, that makes them wait, that leaves them on pause. And believe me, this is no coincidence. Jacobo Grinberg spoke of a network of information beyond the visible. He said that the human brain, through the individual neuronal field, filters what it perceives from the world, and that variables intervene in that filter that are not always rational. Limiting beliefs, social programming, childhood experiences, and even unprocessed emotions that crystallize into reality. Thus, a woman may think she desires love, but be vibrating from fear. She may desire companionship, but project rejection. She may long for connection, but unconsciously emit a signal of absolute self-sufficiency that prevents any real approach. This is not blame, and it is fundamental to understand this from the start. No one consciously chooses to remain alone out of pain. No one says, "I'm going to stay single for 5, 10, or 20 years. But when the neuronal field is structured in a certain way, when there are unresolved emotional wounds, family mandates, inherited unconscious ideas, all this becomes a kind of filter that prevents certain experiences from entering our life. In Grinberg's words, the interface between the individual neuronal field and the universal information field is distorted. That is, It's not that love is not available. It's that perhaps you're not connecting to its frequency. And here arises the great question that drives us to look beyond. What if it wasn't your fault? What if your story of being single wasn't a sign of failure, but a consequence of invisible factors that you were never taught to identify, transform, or release? What if, instead of repeating phrases like, "there must be something wrong with me," you could begin to understand that there's an energetic, perceptual, and emotional dynamic that needs to be recognized? Perhaps it's not about trying harder, lowering your standards, or constantly exposing yourself. Perhaps it's about changing the way you are structuring your perceptual field. Perhaps, as Grinberg said, the first step toward a different life is not to do something different outside, but to be someone different inside. And if you are willing to look at that inside, to question what you take for granted, to observe your story from the light of love and not judgment, this journey will transform you. We will go step by step. First, we will look at visible and invisible causes that affect this experience of female singleness. Then we will explore how the neuronal field works from Grinberg's approach and how you can begin to reprogram it. I will also share real stories of women who spent years feeling broken or incomplete until they understood that it was not about finding someone outside, but reconciling with their deepest truth. This video is not a magic formula, nor a quick recipe. It is a space of awareness. And if you have made it this far, it is because something inside you is ready to understand what once hurt you without knowing why. Remember, you are not alone. And most importantly, you are not broken. Maybe you just need to look at your story from another level of consciousness. So breathe. Let go for a moment of all those internal demands. Forget for a moment everything you were told you should be or have by a certain age. And allow yourself to be here, open, with the curiosity of someone who does not seek blame but clarity. Because sometimes, the real reason why a woman remains single is not fate, nor bad luck, nor even her decisions. Sometimes, it is simply a perceptual field that needs tuning. And when that happens, everything changes. Let's begin. How many times have we heard seemingly logical explanations about why someone remains single? Phrases like, "she doesn't give herself chances," "she's probably too demanding," "she still hasn't healed from past," or even more cruel ones like, "she must have something wrong." These are quick, easy-to-repeat conclusions, accepted almost without question. But how deep are they really? And how many are useful to truly understand what is going on? In this part of the journey, we will pause to look at those causes that are right before our eyes, the visible ones, those that society has established as official explanations. And then we will begin to slowly dive into what is unspoken, invisible, what even the person herself may be unaware of. Because it's not only about pointing to external factors. It is about understanding the more subtle roots that shape our decisions, our emotions, and even our silences. From a social and cultural perspective, singleness has historically been seen as a transitional stage. It is expected that everyone, especially women, go through it but eventually find someone. There is a prevailing narrative that links personal value to having a partner. This cultural pressure manifests in many forms. Family comments, movie scripts, songs, social celebrations where the focus always seems to be on being with someone. The idea is transmitted that a full life begins when you find your better half. However, real life doesn't work that way. There are people who, even wanting a relationship, do not find one. Others who have searched for years without establishing stable or meaningful bonds. Some take refuge in work, friends, spirituality, or art. And although many manage to build a beautiful, solid, and abundant life, the shadow of the question returns again and again: why am I alone? Culturally, expectations around relationships have changed. In previous generations, marriage was almost a social obligation. Today, there is more freedom, more possibilities, more paths. But that freedom, although powerful, can also come accompanied by confusion, pressure to choose well, fear of repeating past generations' mistakes. In other words, the body has been freed, but not necessarily the mind. And here we enter a more complex territory, because although social and cultural causes are clear, they do not always explain why two people with similar histories have such different paths. Why does someone with the same resources, education, and environment manage to form a stable and satisfying partnership, while another remains in a kind of endless waiting. Jacobo Grinberg proposed that our lives are not shaped solely by external factors, but by the way we perceive, interpret, and process reality. His theory of the neuronal field establishes that every person generates a mental structure, a network of connections that defines what is perceived as possible or impossible, desirable or undesirable, safe or threatening. This field is not static. It is dynamic, influenceable, and most importantly, it is largely unconscious. So what we often interpret as a personal choice may be conditioned by invisible structures, beliefs that were installed in childhood, phrases heard over and over again at home such as better alone than in bad company, all men are the same, love hurts, or never depend on anyone. Even painful experiences, whether personal or inherited, can leave such deep marks that, although not consciously remembered, continue to operate as patterns that block, push away, or sabotage emotional bonds. At this point, it is worth considering the following. What if we are not seeing the whole picture? What if, beyond the visible factors, there are hidden layers of emotional programming operating silently? This question is not meant to generate guilt, but to open a new possibility that many decisions we believe we are making freely may in reality be influenced by structures we do not even know exist. Let's take an example. Imagine a person who, in their family history, has repeatedly seen women suffer in their relationships. Mothers who gave themselves up for love, aunts who endured abuse, older sisters who sacrificed themselves to keep a home. That person, as they grow up, may develop an unconscious association between love and pain, between partnership and loss of freedom. Despite wanting a relationship, something inside them prevents them from moving forward. Why? Because their neuronal field registers emotional closeness as a threat, not an opportunity. Thus, they may be attracted to emotionally distant people, sabotage healthy relationships, or simply let opportunities pass without knowing why. This phenomenon does not distinguish gender, social class, or level of consciousness. It affects us all in different ways. And the most unsettling part is that it does not always manifest clearly. Sometimes it hides behind justifications that sound logical. I don't have time. It's not a priority in my life. Love isn't what it used to be. But if we go deeper, if we allow ourselves to look beneath the surface, we may find emotions that have not been processed. Fear, anger, distrust, sadness, feelings of unworthiness, or an old wound of abandonment that is not yet healed. Grinberg proposed that the universe operates as an interconnected fabric of consciousness, and that each person from their neuronal field can distort, modulate, or expand their interaction with that fabric. If the field is charged with fear, it will attract corresponding experiences. If it is aligned with openness, it will generate transformative encounters. Therefore, understanding invisible causes is not only a psychological or philosophical matter. It is also a way of assuming the creative power that we all hold in our hands. And here emerges a very interesting paradox. The more aware we become, the more responsibility we have over our experience. It is no longer just about blaming others, the past, or society. It is about accepting that, although we may not have chosen certain wounds, we can decide how to heal them. That even if we do not remember everything that shaped us, we can transform the structure that contains us. The problem is that we often seek answers outside ourselves. We tell ourselves that when the right person appears, everything will fall into place. But that is not always the case. Because if we have not done the work of observing our own structures, even that right person may go unnoticed, or we may reject them without knowing why, or we may enter a relationship only to repeat the same patterns as before. Not because we are weak, not because we do not deserve love, but because we continue to operate from a neuronal field that has not yet been reconfigured. This is not esotericism. It is neuroscience applied to human experience. Grinberg, with his transdisciplinary approach, managed to integrate elements of mysticism, psychology, biology, and physics to build a bridge between the visible and the invisible. And although his theory has not always been understood by the traditional scientific community, today, more than ever, his ideas are being embraced by new currents that understand that the human being is not a sum of organs, nor a collection of ideas, but a complex network of consciousness in constant interaction. Therefore, instead of continuing to repeat simplistic explanations, it is worth starting to ask ourselves, What is there inside me that I have not yet seen? What patterns am I repeating? What emotions am I avoiding feeling? What beliefs have I inherited without questioning? And above all, am I willing to reconfigure my field to allow a different experience? Understanding the invisible causes that influence effective decisions does not mean denying the importance of the evident. In fact, both dimensions are constantly intertwined. It is not about choosing between what is outside or what occurs inside the mind, but about learning to see how the external activates, reinforces, or contradicts the internal. That is, how the environment can confirm patterns already planted in consciousness, or how it can be a mirror that reflects back what we have yet to heal. Let's consider a common example. A person enters a social setting, open to meeting someone with a positive attitude, but with a deeply rooted internal thought. I'm probably not enough for anyone. Although this thought is silent, that belief acts as a filter. It influences their body language, tone of voice, and the way they hold or avoid eye contact. Without anyone saying a word, it creates an invisible distance. The interactions around them usually confirm what they already believe, that they are unseen, uninteresting, that something must be wrong. What's most troubling is that it's not that the environment actively rejects them, but rather that it often simply doesn't respond, and that silence hurts more than 1,000 words. Here is where Grinberg's notion of the neuronal field comes in with greater force. He stated that perception is not passive, but active. We don't just see the world. We actively construct it based on our own internal connections. Our brain does not capture reality like an objective camera, but selects, distorts, and reorganizes stimuli according to its prior programming. In simple terms, we see what we believe. From this perspective, prolonged singleness is not necessarily a mistake or tragedy, but a manifestation of how a perceptual field has been structured. Sometimes this field has been designed to protect, to avoid suffering again, to defend a space of autonomy that took years to build. Other times, it has been shaped by unresolved traumas that remain active at an unconscious level. The important thing is to understand that it's not about blaming anyone, but about recognizing the enormous power in the way we perceive, and that power can be transformed. When one begins to look inward honestly, they may find old traces still alive. Perhaps there is an inner child who associated love with absence. Maybe there is a teenager who never felt chosen. Maybe there's a young person who learned to suppress their emotions to avoid seeming weak. All those memories, even if not at the forefront, continue to operate. They color the present, condition relationships, make a person seek companionship, but simultaneously reject it. It is a kind of emotional paradox, the desire to love coexisting with the fear of being hurt. And this leads us to a profound truth. Many times, what presents as a choice to be alone is actually a form of protection, an unconscious strategy to avoid feeling again what once hurt too much. The problem is that over time this protection can become a prison, and the person may become trapped in a routine of apparent independence, but with a deep background of loneliness. Grinberg spoke of the mantle of perception as a structure that envelopes each individual and, depending on its configuration, connects or separates them from others. This mantle is not physical. It is a network of meanings, memories, emotions, thoughts, past experiences, and energetic frequencies that shape the way we interact with the world. If this mantle is charged with fear, betrayal, abandonment, or shame, it will be very difficult to attract or sustain healthy and fulfilling relationships. And it's not because a person doesn't deserve it. It's because they are connecting from a frequency not aligned with what they desire. It's like trying to tune a radio station, but being on the wrong frequency. What comes through is noise, confusion, interference. And over time, that noise can make the person believe that they simply are not made for love, when in reality, love is available. It just needs to be perceived from another field. Therefore, the path of transformation does not only go through going out more, talking to more people, trying dating. While all those things can be useful, if there is no transformation of the neuronal field, of the deep beliefs, of the invisible patterns, the results tend to repeat, and that can lead to exhaustion, frustration, resignation. Now, transforming the neuronal field is not a quick task. It is not achieved with empty affirmations or forced positivity. It is a process that requires courage, sincerity, and above all, presence. It involves pausing, looking inward, recognizing wounds, honoring the journey, and opening to new possibilities. It is a work of consciousness, energy, mind, and soul, and each person experiences it at their own pace. But the important thing is to know that this change is possible, that the brain is plastic, that connections can be reconfigured, that emotional energy can be released. And when this happens, what once seemed impossible begins to take shape, not because the world changes, but because the way we relate to it has changed. One of the most revolutionary elements of Grinberg's thinking is precisely this: the possibility that the observer transforms the observed object. In other words, by changing our field, the reality we experience changes. This is not magic. It is quantum physics applied to the field of consciousness. It is understanding that we are active creators of our experience, and that power is not found in the future nor in anyone else's hands. It is here, now, in the way we decide to look, feel, and interpret. And when that gaze becomes compassionate, when we stop judging ourselves for being alone, when we stop blaming ourselves for what didn't work, when we understand that each stage fulfilled a function, then something inside begins to free itself. And with that liberation, a new way of being in the world emerges. A more authentic, open, vibrant way. Singleness, then, can cease to be a condemnation and become a path of self-discovery, healing, and true empowerment. And from there, from that deep and conscious place, fuller, healthier, more real relationships can be born, not based on need or fear, but on a genuine encounter between two beings who choose each other from freedom. This entire process begins with the decision to look inward, to stop repeating inherited explanations, to assume responsibility without guilt, to embrace one's own story with love, and to trust that by changing our perception, we change our experience. Just as Grinberg invites us to explore the relationship between mind and reality, this journey we undertake together invites us to recognize that we are not alone in our processes, that there are collective patterns, shared wounds, and also universal possibilities for healing and reconnection. The key lies in daring to see what was previously unseen, in illuminating the shadows, in listening to what had not been said. Perhaps there, at the very moment someone decides to look at their story with new eyes, the necessary field begins to form for love to arrive, not from need, but from fullness, not to fill a void, but to share an inner abundance that has been carefully cultivated, and that ultimately is what transforms life. Every human being lives within a model of reality, and we are not talking about a simple opinion or perspective. We are talking about an internal structure that shapes what we believe possible, what we consider achievable, what we allow to enter our lives. This model of reality is like a network, a combination of experiences, memories, emotions, learnings, and beliefs that filter, interpret, and make sense of what happens. And, although often unnoticed, that network determines the bonds we create, sustain, or avoid. Jacobo Grinberg understood this network as an interface between the inner world and the universal quantum field. In his theory of the synergic model, Grinberg proposed that we do not live in an objective, singular reality, but that each person constructs their experience of the world from their own neuronal field. In other words, we do not see things as they are, but as we are. And this becomes especially relevant when talking about relationships, partnerships, companionship, love. Why do some people seem to live the same type of emotional story again and again? Why do others avoid commitment without knowing why? Why can someone feel lonely even surrounded by emotional opportunities? The answer, in many cases, lies not in what happens outside, but in how that model reality has been woven from within. Since childhood, we begin to assemble our internal map. Through the eyes of our parents or caregivers, the messages we receive, moments of affection or abandonment, patterns are built that not only tell us what relationships are like, but how we should position ourselves in them. For example, if someone grows up in an environment where love is linked to suffering or constant effort, they will likely internalize the idea that loving means sacrifice or that it is never enough. And if that pattern is not questioned, it becomes part of the model reality. This model is not limited to conscious ideas. It also includes repressed emotions, unexpressed desires, open wounds, and even bodily memories. That is why many times we can desire something with our mind, but act in the opposite direction without realizing it. We want a stable relationship, but choose unstable bonds. We want companionship, but isolate ourselves. We want love, but distrust. All of that is coherent with the internal model, with the perceptual network that, though it may not seem so, is trying to protect us. Grinberg maintained that the neuronal field works as a generator of realities. It does not simply capture what happens, but organizes it according to what the person has learned to expect from the world. Thus, those who have been hurt tend to anticipate rejection. Those who have been abandoned expect distance. Those who have experienced betrayal distrust. And that, instead of allowing new experiences, perpetuates the past, because each projects their story onto the present, even unintentionally. In this sense, prolonged singleness, far from being a coincidence, may reflect a reality model that, for various reasons, has excluded love as an accessible experience, not because the person has rationally decided so, but because their internal network does not consider it safe, possible, or deserved. This may seem harsh, but it is an invitation to look deeply. One of Grinberg's most powerful ideas is that this network can change, that we are not doomed to repeat our history, that we are not victims of a fixed emotional destiny. On the contrary, we are co-creators of the reality we live. And if we become aware of our model, if we observe it honestly, if we dismantle it with compassion, we can open space for a different experience. This requires will and patience, because wanting a partner is not enough. It is necessary to examine what internal space is available for one. Is there fear? Is there resentment? Are there beliefs that say, I am not enough, or better alone than suffering again? All of this is part of the model. And as long as those corners are not illuminated, the field will continue attracting similar experiences, not as punishment, but as energetic coherence. The reality model also includes the images we hold of others. Often, single people not only have a limited self-concept, but also an unconscious image of the other filled with suspicion, criticism, or idealization. And that prevents real encounter. Because if I expect the other to hurt me, I will probably attract someone who does. If I expect them to be perfect, I will end up disappointed. If I believe no one can understand me, I will close the doors even before anyone tries to knock. The key is to make the model conscious, to observe which images repeat, which internal phrases appear when talking about love, which emotions arise in the face of closeness. And here, the fundamental tool is presence, being present with what we feel without judging it, giving space to fear, sadness, anger, but also to longing, tenderness, possibility. When we give ourselves permission to explore our internal network without labels, without external pressures, without demands to have it all figured out, something new begins to emerge, a new configuration of the model, kinder, more authentic, more open, and from there, from that new internal vibration, other experiences begin to arrive. The reality model changes when one allows oneself to feel differently, when one permits oneself to receive, when one lets life touch them. There is no single formula, but there is one certainty. All change begins inside, and as that change occurs, the external field responds. Grinberg emphasized the importance of conscious intention, not as a mere wish, but as a structuring force of the field. Intention is the compass. It is what directs the energy. When someone genuinely, from the soul, proposes to live a different experience, that act generates movement. The field begins to reconfigure. And although it may not always be immediately visible, the process has already started. Therefore, this path is not linear. It has ups and downs, setbacks, moments of doubt. But every step counts. Every moment of awareness leaves a mark. Every act of self-love strengthens the internal network. And over time, that new network becomes stronger than the previous one, more coherent, more luminous. Love then ceases to be a distant goal and becomes a natural extension of one's inner state. And there, on that frequency, true encounters become possible, not by magic, but by resonance. And thus we understand an essential truth. We do not attract what we want. We attract what we are. And if we are presence, openness, and authenticity, that is what we will begin to see reflected in the world. There's a question many people ask after experiencing a failed relationship. Why did I end up here? Some attribute it to chance. others to destiny, some more to their own decisions or mistakes. And there are those who, from a more spiritual perspective, interpret it as karma. But what if the answer lies in a deeper dimension? What if, beyond karma or rational logic, there is something else? An unconscious choice that repeats until it becomes conscious. Failed relationships are not simple emotional accidents. They are not random events that happen without meaning. Each one, no matter how painful or frustrating, leaves clues. They speak of wounds that have not yet healed, emotional patterns we continue, without realizing it, beliefs that sustain our reality model. Understanding this is not about blame. It is about opening to the possibility of healing from the root. Jacobo Grinberg spoke of a powerful idea, the entanglement of realities. According to him, every human being lives immersed in a personal neural field that connects, intertwines, or repels other fields. When two people meet, their fields do not just interact on a physical or emotional level, but interfere on subtle levels. If there is compatibility, a harmonic fusion occurs. If there is distortion, the relationship enters conflict. But in both cases, what happens is not random. It is a kind of vibrational mirror. Therefore, when a relationship ends badly, it is not enough to say I was wrong or that person was toxic. One must look deeper. What part of me allowed, attracted, or even sought that experience? Not from blame, but from curiosity and responsibility. What belief was operating behind it? What unrecognized need was it trying to fulfill? What wound was seeking to be seen? Many times, what we call love is actually a way of recreating old bonds, hoping to heal them. It is common, for example, for someone to look for characteristics similar to parental figures in their partners, even if those characteristics were painful or dysfunctional. And this is not irrational. It is a deep attempt by the internal system to resolve what was left unfinished. But if it remains unconscious, it repeats over and over without resolution. From Grinberg's synergic vision, what happens in a relationship is an external manifestation of an internal structure. If a person's neural field contains a strong vibration of abandonment, they are likely to end up connecting with someone who abandons them. If there's a wound of invisibility, they will attract someone who does not see them. If there's fear of rejection, they will unknowingly seek someone who confirms that fear, not because they want to, but because their field is programmed to recognize and connect with that frequency. And here lies the great opportunity. Every broken relationship can be a door, an invitation to see what the other came to show. Sometimes the lesson is to say enough, to set a boundary, to choose differently. Other times it is to forgive, to let go, to understand that the other acted from their own model, from their own wounds, and that it is not personal, it is vibrational. This leads us to a completely different view of failed relationships. It is no longer about getting over the other or winning a breakup. It is about integrating the lesson, about taking what was lived as part of the journey, about understanding that even the hardest relationships bring deep teachings if one knows how to look. Over time, many people begin to notice a pattern. They get involved with the same type of person, live the same type of dynamic, end in a similar way. That is no coincidence. It is unconscious repetition. It is a neural network operating automatically. And until that pattern becomes visible, it will continue activating with different faces, in different contexts, but with the same background. Grinberg explained that entangled fields tend to mutually reinforce each other. Therefore, if one of the two does not modify their vibration, the relationship remains in a loop. But if one of the two changes their field, raises their perception, modifies their beliefs, heals their wounds, then the pattern can be broken. And that transforms not only the bond, but the entire life experience. This is the point where pain becomes power. When we stop seeing ourselves as victims of what happened and begin to see ourselves as active participants in the process. It does not mean justifying the unjustifiable, nor tolerating the intolerable. It means assuming that, at some level, something within us was available for that experience. And now we can choose differently. Modern psychology has also begun to explore this phenomenon from other angles. We talk about insecure attachment, avoidant bonds, emotional dependence, relational traumas. All these concepts align with the idea that our relationships are not random. They are structured from what we learned in childhood, from what we saw, from what we were not given. But Grinberg went further. He proposed that it is not only about healing the past, but about reconfiguring the field of perception in the present. And that is revolutionary, because it does not require everything to be resolved to start living differently. Rather, it demands a daily commitment to awareness, to noticing, to observing without judgment, to practicing a new way of being in the world, even when the world has not yet changed. Thus, every broken relationship ceases to be a failure and becomes a teacher, not as consolation, but as a vibrational reality, because what hurts teaches, and what teaches transforms. There is something deeply liberating in understanding that we are not bound by our past choices, that we are not defined by our mistakes, that no matter how many times we have chosen from fear, lack, or illusion, we can always choose differently. There's always a new possibility. And that possibility begins when we pause. When instead of fleeing from pain, we listen to it. When instead of blaming the other, we ask ourselves, what part of me chose this? What pattern was activated? What do I need to see that I was not seeing? From there begins a new journey. One in which love is not sought to fill voids, but to share fullness. One in which the usual is not repeated, but something new is written. One in which relationships are not lived as salvation, but as expansion. Because when the field is cleansed, when the pattern is broken, when perception expands, then something new appears. A type of bond that is not based on need, habit, or fear of loneliness. A bond born of consciousness, of freedom, of true love, which is not possession nor dependence, but shared presence. At some point along the way, most people stop to observe their failed relationships with some distance, no longer from immediate anger or paralyzing sadness, but from a more mature, curious perspective. It is then that a key question arises: what did I come to learn in this relationship? And that single question, when asked sincerely, has the power to open entirely new paths. Because every emotional experience reflects back to ourselves, even the most painful, even those we would prefer to forget. Deep down, every bond is a mirror. It shows us what we love, what we fear, what we deny, what we have not yet healed. And if we know how to read that mirror, instead of breaking it, we can begin to rebuild our story from a different place. Jacobo Grinberg proposed that the entanglement between fields of consciousness is not random, that the people we bond would resonate with deep aspects of our own neuronal field. And this does not always mean we are at the same level of consciousness, but that there are unconscious elements seeking to be resolved, understood, integrated. In this sense, a relationship can be both a refuge and a test, a place of growth or a repetition of trauma. And here we enter a more subtle dimension. The soul also chooses beyond logic. Many times we feel attracted to people who activate precisely what we do not want to see. But it is not punishment. It is opportunity. Because what is activated can be healed. What is illuminated can be transformed. And what repeats can be stopped when it becomes conscious. The idea of unconscious choice can be difficult to accept at first. It sounds unfair. Who would want to choose to suffer? Who would want to bond with someone who does not value them, who ignores them, who hurts them? But it is not about wanting. It is about vibrational fields seeking to reorganize. And that reorganization, though uncomfortable, is deeply transformative when approached with awareness. In many failed relationships, there are hidden dynamics, roles that repeat themselves, cycles that seem never-ending, people who become diminished versions of themselves to maintain a bond, others who lose themselves trying to please, avoiding conflict, enduring the unbearable out of fear of being alone. And in the end, what remains is a feeling of emptiness even greater than before it began. But even that emptiness is useful because it exposes a truth that cannot be ignored. Authentic love cannot be built from disconnection with oneself, and that in itself is a revelation because it returns power to us. It reminds us that we don't need to complete anyone, nor be completed. That real love begins within, with how we treat ourselves, with how we speak to ourselves, with how we choose to inhabit our own life. When a person commits to their process of awareness, relationships change. Sometimes, this means letting go of bonds no longer aligned with the new vibration. Other times, it means relearning to connect from a different place, without demands or masks. It means showing oneself as they truly are and allowing the other to do the same, without trying to change them, without wanting them to fit a mold, simply recognizing them as a being in process, just like oneself. Grinberg explained that by modifying our neuronal field, we not only change our choices, but also the kind of people who come into our lives, because we no longer seek from lack, but from completeness. We no longer project what's missing, but share who we are, and that transforms everything. This is the point where karma becomes choice, because although we may have inherited patterns, stories, mandates, there's always a moment when we can decide to look inward, decide to make peace with what was lived, decide to break cycles that no longer nurture, decide that we deserve more, not out of whim, but out of dignity, out of awareness, out of evolution. And at that moment, relationships stop being battlegrounds and become spaces of expansion. It's no longer about enduring, convincing, or surviving love. It's about growing together, accompanying each other in freedom, nourishing each other without losing individuality. This does not mean everything will be easy. Conscious love also has challenges. It also activates wounds. It also confronts. But the difference lies in internal willingness. We no longer react from the wound, but respond from awareness. We no longer seek to control, but to understand. We no longer act from fear, but from love. And this is something we can all cultivate, regardless of our past, our experiences, the times we have stumbled. We can always start anew. We can always choose to rewrite our story, not denying what was, but re-signifying it, understanding that every step, no matter how twisted, brought us here. And here is a good place to begin again. Sometimes, this new beginning means spending some time alone, but not an empty solitude, rather a fertile one, a solitude that is not an escape, but an encounter, a solitude that allows us to order the field, clarify intentions, reconnect with purpose. Because only when we are at peace with our own company can we share ourselves freely without fear of disappearing into the other. And that is the paradox of true love. It arises when we no longer need it to feel whole. It emerges when we stop seeking the other what only we can give ourselves. It blooms when we are willing to see the other as they are, without idealizations or demands. And also when we are capable of seeing ourselves with the same compassion. Grinberg would say that at that point, the fields no longer intertwine through shared lacks, but through coherent vibrations. And that creates a new reality, a way of being in a world where relationship is not a risk zone, but a space of expansion. These kinds of bonds are not built overnight. They require awareness, presence, practice, but they are worth every step. Because once achieved, the same mistakes are no longer repeated. Pain is no longer the source of attraction. Unconsciousness no longer governs. Choices are made with clarity. Love is given with freedom. Presence is maintained with integrity. And that, in the end, is the great gift of this whole process. Understanding that we are not condemned to repeat the same. That love is not a lottery, nor an exception. It is a real possibility for those willing to look at themselves, transform, elevate their field, heal their story. It's not about luck. It's about consciousness. And once awakened, that consciousness can no longer fall asleep. If something inside you has moved up to this point, if you have felt part of this also speaks to your story, I invite you to leave a comment telling me which moment in this reflection touched you the most. Your experience can inspire others, and together we can build a shared space of awareness. And if you haven't yet, subscribe now and activate the notification bell to keep exploring these topics that not everyone dares to face, but that many of us need to feel. Accepting that true love transforms is not always easy. In theory, we all say, I want an authentic relationship. I want to love truly. I want something deep. But in practice, depth is not always comfortable. It is not always romantic. Depth stirs things up. Depth touches areas where the self has not wanted to go. That's why many people begin to distance themselves just as things get real. Not because they don't care, but because real love demands presence. and presence confronts. The question is not whether a person desires to love. Most do. The real question is, are they willing to surrender to what love reveals about themselves? Are they ready to let go of certain forms of control, pride, and rigid identification with who they are? Because that is the threshold. Not so much an encounter with the other, but in what that encounter awakens in the most intimate depths. Jacobo Grinberg stated that to access the expanded field of consciousness, one must pass through what he called the perceptual cage of the ego. He didn't see the ego as evil, but as a useful structure that, when rigid, prevents a direct experience of the sacred, the real, the unity. In relationships, this cage manifests as a need to be right, to always protect oneself, to avoid vulnerability, to define the other before truly knowing them. But love cannot flourish inside a cage. It may survive for a while, but sooner or later it withers, because love needs space. It needs silence. It needs surrender. And that surrender, when it happens, is transformative. The person who truly loves is never the same again, not because they get lost, but because they discover themselves on levels they hadn't known. The ego rearranges, the self changes shape, and in that movement there is life. It's important to say, it's not about disappearing for the other. It's not about merging until losing oneself. That would be another form of avoidance. It's about allowing the bond to be a school, that every gesture, every word, every conflict even, becomes an opportunity to look more deeply at oneself. The other doesn't come to complete us, but they can show us what we still need to integrate. And that is one of the great gifts of conscious love. It makes us visible. It reveals us. It pulls us out of the cave of the persona. And sometimes that hurts, because maybe we have built an entire identity around strength, autonomy, the I don't need anyone stance. And suddenly, someone arrives and unintentionally touches the place where we feel most fragile. What do we do with that? We can run away. We can deny. We can blame the other for destabilizing us. Or we can stay, breathe, feel, and allow that crack to be a door. Grinberg explained that the neuronal field, when it comes into contact with another field with vibrational strength, tends to reorganize. That is what happens when someone touches our soul. It's not just emotional, it's energetic. There's a real reconfiguration. And if we are not ready, we may resist it. But if we accept the process, what emerges is a new self, broader, more whole, more capable of holding love without fear. In practice, this means learning to stay, not running away when the other sees us cry, not masking discomfort with irony, saying, I'm scared, but I want to try, because that is what builds a true bond, not perfection, not absolute security, but the willingness to go through together whatever arises. Many bonds break not for lack of love, but for excess fear, because when the other's mirror appears and we see ourselves clearly reflected, ancient shame can arise, a feeling of exposure. I can no longer hide. And for those who have long held a tough, self-sufficient, invulnerable image, that can be unbearable. But it is precisely there, right there where the portal lies, because the identity that falls apart in love is not the true one. It is the one that served us to survive, to protect ourselves, to function in a world that sometimes rewards disconnection. But we no longer need it, or at least not for everything. Real love does not ask us to be perfect. It asks us to be honest, to be human, to be willing to learn, fail, repair, not to hide when we feel small, to look the other in the eye and say, sometimes I'm scared, but I want to do this with you. That is the new spirituality of love, not the idealized one, the embodied one, the one built with presence, listening, soul. And this, in terms of Grinberg's model, is an expansion of the field. Because when the ego stops defending its old shape, consciousness expands. And by expanding, it accesses a different reality, not external, but perceptual. The world seems to change, but in truth, it is we who see from another level, from a less rigid, more connected, more authentic self. There is something deeply liberating about letting go of the internal struggle to maintain an image, because in the end, true rest is in being oneself. And when that happens inside a relationship, love blooms as a natural act, not as a conquest, nor a sacrifice, as an inevitable consequence of openness. And that openness can be experienced in many contexts: an intimate conversation, a shared silence, a hug after an argument. Conscious love does not need grand gestures. It manifests in the everyday, in the willingness to be present, even when there are no answers, in the daily choice to look with new eyes, listen with an open heart, trust that the bond is stronger than the sum of its parts. When the self allows itself to transform, something much greater can be born, not a we that negates, but a we that empowers, that elevates, that multiplies, that sustains. And that kind of connection not only heals old wounds, but creates a different reality, more coherent, more luminous, more loving. That is why the fear of the dissolution of the self is also the gateway to the expansion of being. You don't fight it. You understand it, embrace it, thank it for what it protected, and then gently invite it to transform, to stop being a cage and become a bridge. Thus, love ceases to be a threat, and it becomes what it always has been at the deepest level, a path to the sacred. Not the idealized sacred, but the everyday sacred, the one that occurs when two people choose each other in truth, when they stop running away, when they dare to inhabit themselves. And in that place, everything changes. So far, we have explored the invisible root of many emotional experiences, the personal neuronal field, the construction of the reality model, and the role that the ego plays in perception of love. But knowing this is not enough. True transformation happens when that knowledge becomes practice, when what is learned is brought to the body, to routine, to daily breathing. And that transformation begins with a deep decision to change the field of perception. Jacobo Grinberg maintained that our neural field is not fixed, but plastic and adaptable. It is influenced by what we believe, what we feel, and the images we hold over time. And while that field may have been structured by wounds, mandates, or traumas, it can also be consciously modified through certain tools. In other words, it doesn't matter how your story was. What really matters is how you decide to live it from now on. The first step is to recognize that you perceive through filters. This, though it seems simple, is revolutionary. It means accepting that what you see is not necessarily objective reality, but reality conditioned by your internal state. And this is not about denying the facts, but about opening up to the possibility that many of your interpretations, especially on emotional matters, are colored by what you carry inside. For example, if every time someone seems distant you feel abandonment, maybe that person is not actually abandoning you, but your perception field activates that pattern as an automatic reading. If every time someone doesn't respond as you expect, you feel rejection, perhaps it is not real rejection, but an old feeling of not being enough projected onto the present. And in that difference, in that small space between what happens and how you interpret it, lies the door to change everything. So, how does one begin to transform that field? One of the most powerful methods is meditation, but not as an unattainable mystical practice, rather as an exercise in sustained presence. Meditating is not about emptying the mind or escaping problems. Meditating is observing. It is creating space. It is noticing thoughts without identifying with them. It is realizing that you are not your story, nor your emotion, nor your wound. You are the one observing all that. Grinberg said that full consciousness, observation without judgment, has the power to restructure the neuronal field. When one remains present before a limiting thought without rejecting or feeding it, that thought loses strength, and over time it dissolves, because what is illuminated with consciousness ceases to have unconscious power. A simple yet profound practice is meditation with conscious breathing. You only need 5 or 10 minutes a day. Sit quietly. Bring your attention to the breath. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, and as you breathe, observe what arises. Don't fight the thoughts. Don't try to change them. Just observe them like clouds crossing the sky. This simple act trains your mind not to react, not to identify, to leave space. And that space is what allows the field of perception to begin expanding. Another fundamental tool is reflective writing. It's not about writing beautifully or making poetry. It's about writing to clear the field, each morning or night. Take paper and pencil and let your thoughts flow uncensored. Today I felt fear when they didn't answer me. I feel anger because I feel invisible. I have the sense that I don't deserve love. It doesn't matter what comes out. What matters is that it comes out. Because what is expressed stops making us sick. And what is recognized can be transformed. Grinberg explained that language has an organizing power over the neuronal field. By putting words to a vague emotion, that emotion becomes manageable. It becomes human. It integrates. And it stops operating from shadows. That is why writing is not just catharsis. It is a creative act, a declaration of consciousness, a way to narrate yourself differently, to stop being a victim of the story and start being the author of a new version of yourself. A third tool is the conscious reprogramming of beliefs. This is not about repeating empty affirmations like, I am happy, I am loved, if inside you feel the opposite. It is a deeper process. It begins by identifying the phrases that repeat in your mind, the ones that appear when you are alone. When something doesn't go as expected, when you feel fear, some of those phrases might be, I am not enough, love is not for me, if I show myself, I get hurt, if I give myself, I abandon myself. Write down those phrases. Look at them as if they weren't yours, as if they were words someone else told you and you adopted unknowingly. Then write alternative versions, not forced, not fanciful. Kinder, more realistic, more human versions. For example, I can be enough even if sometimes I doubt myself. Love can be safe if I choose it consciously. My vulnerability doesn't make me weak, it makes me real. Read those new phrases every morning and every night, aloud, calmly, not as a magical act, but as a way to train your mind to choose new neural pathways. Grinberg would say this act is a way to modify the structure of the field, because when the word aligns with intention, reality begins to respond. Beyond these individual practices, there is one tool with a multiplying effect: connection with others from authenticity, speaking from the heart, without strategies, without defenses, sharing what's happening with you, even if it's not perfect, asking for help, listening, accompanying, being available, because the field also feeds on the bond. And when there's a real, honest, empathetic encounter, the field naturally expands. Grinberg spoke of the entanglement of fields as a source of healing. When two people meet from their essence, they don't just share words. They share information, energy, consciousness. They mutually reconfigure. They mutually uplift. And whether that bond lasts a conversation or a lifetime, the impact is real. It is transformative. Changing the field of perception is not a one-day task. It is a path, a process. Sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes clear, sometimes confusing. But every step counts. Every time you choose to observe instead of react. Every time you decide to speak with love instead of responding with anger. Every time you allow yourself to feel without judgment. Every time you breathe, right? Listen. Each of those actions is reconfiguring your field, and therefore your life. And most importantly, you are not alone in this. We are all on this path, each with their story, with their wounds, with their ways of protecting themselves. But all of us, deep down, desiring the same thing, to live a fuller, more conscious, more loving experience. One of the most powerful keys to changing the field of perception lies in understanding that all change begins in the subtle. Before life transforms outwardly, an inner readjustment occurs. And that readjustment begins with small acts of awareness, repeated with intention. No great revelation or extraordinary mystical experience is needed. It is enough to return again and again to presence, to the body, to the moment, to start dissolving old patterns that no longer serve. Grinberg stated that who we are is not a finished product, but a possibility in constant evolution, that our neuronal field is in permanent communication with the universal information field, and that this exchange is mediated by attention. What is observed is strengthened. What is ignored weakens. That is why, each time you choose to focus on love, openness, gratitude, you are strengthening that vibration within you. You are tuning into a different frequency. A simple practice that can be integrated into daily life is conscious grounding in the senses. Often, the mind generates chaotic realities because it disconnects from the body. The body, however, is always in the present. Therefore, one way to calm the internal field is to reconnect with the senses. A very useful exercise is the following. When you feel your mind starting to spiral with repetitive thoughts, especially related to past relationships, fears about the future, or judgments about yourself, pause for a few seconds and do a sensory break. Observe 5 things you can see at that moment. Then name 4 things you can touch, 3 sounds you can hear, 2 smells, and 1 physical sensation you have in your body. This small exercise, which takes no more than 3 minutes, has a direct effect on the nervous system. It reduces stress field activation and brings you back to center. Grinberg would say it is a way to return perception to its basal state, the here and now without distortion. Another deeply transformative tool is guided visualization. Many people associate visualization with fantasy, but in reality, the brain does not clearly distinguish between what it imagines and what it experiences. That is why visualizing an emotional state, such as calm, openness, or connection, can modify brain chemistry and therefore the frequency of the neuronal field. You can try this. Every night before sleeping, close your eyes and visualize yourself entering a full relationship. Not an idealized relationship, but a real, conscious, luminous connection. Imagine being with someone who sees you, listens to you, accompanies you from freedom. Observe how you feel in that bond, what emotions arise, how your body is in that state, what you do, how you speak, what you allow. This exercise is not to cling to an expectation. It is to train the field to tune to new experiences. Over time, that internal vibration begins to reflect in the environment. Grinberg maintained that each frequency emitted from the neuronal field has a correlate in the quantum field. That is, reality responds to the predominant vibration of the observer. Therefore, it is not enough to want something. It is necessary to become someone capable of sustaining what you want, and that implies reviewing whether there is real space inside you to receive what you say you long for. Here comes one of the most challenging but necessary practices: self-forgiveness. Many people carry guilt from past relationships, wrong decisions, weighted silences, or hurtful words, and that guilt becomes a frequency that contaminates the field. It keeps it stagnant, closed, sad. Self-forgiveness does not mean justifying everything done. It means recognizing you did the best you could with what you knew at the time. And today, from another level of consciousness, you can act differently. Write a forgiveness letter to yourself. Say it out loud. Take it to your heart. Grinberg spoke of the power of symbolic acts in transforming the field. A ritual of forgiveness, a conscious farewell, a letter never sent. All are gestures that allow energetic cycles to close and new paths to open. And speaking of new paths, there is a silent but vital practice that supports all real transformation: loving discipline. Many seek to change their life with great impulses, but then get frustrated when they don't see immediate results. What truly transforms is consistency, conscious repetition, the daily decision to be present, to choose a kinder response, to return to center after every fall, to continue, to sustain, to be patient with the process. Grinberg explained clearly, consciousness does not expand by accumulating data, but by repeating presence. And the more time you spend in a conscious state, the more the field reorganizes, until, without realizing it, one day you react differently. You think differently. You attract differently, because you are no longer who you used to be. It is also important to remember that this whole process can and should include external help: a therapist, a guide, a wise friend, a community of people on the same path. You don't need to do it alone. In fact, the field strengthens when shared, when verbalized, when breathed alongside another. Inner work flourishes faster when felt accompanied. And if there is one attitude that can enhance any practice, it is gratitude. Not as a cliche, but as a vibrational state. Gratitude is a frequency of expansion, of openness. When you appreciate what you have, no matter how small, you are telling the universe, I am available for more, and your field registers it. It loosens, it softens, it becomes receptive. You can start every morning by writing 3 things you are grateful for, or end each night remembering a moment of beauty in your day. It doesn't matter if it was minimal. The very act of focusing on that changes your brain chemistry, raises your frequency, tunes your field to abundance. In the end, changing your field of perception is not a goal. It is a daily practice, a state of attention, a way of living. It means looking inward without fear, choosing consciously, dwelling in the present, letting go of what no longer serves, opening to what you do not yet know, and trusting, because when your field changes, everything changes. Not suddenly, not by miracle, but by coherence. And that coherence is cultivated day by day, thought by thought, act by act. Grinberg left us with an immense legacy, the certainty that we are co-creators of our reality, not from whim, but from consciousness. And if we choose to live from there, life transforms into what has always been, even if we hadn't seen it, a fertile space for love, for connection, for expansion. When we talk about transforming the field of perception, it may seem like an abstract idea, a notion difficult to imagine amidst everyday life. But when that transformation becomes story, flesh, emotion, everything changes, because then it is understood that it is not theory, it is life, it is real, it is possible, and most importantly, it is within everyone's reach. This section is dedicated to that, to real stories, to examples showing how a person can move from emotional frustration to clarity, from repeating toxic bonds opening up to true love, from fear to expansion. Stories of ordinary people with wounds, doubts, moment of darkness, who chose a path of consciousness, and by doing so, transformed not only their relationships but their way of inhabiting the world. The first story is Elena's, a 42-year-old woman who had been single for over a decade, not because she didn't want to be, but because, according to her, she couldn't find anyone worth it. She was independent, successful, creative, but also extremely demanding, not only with others, but with herself. She had created such a high ideal of a partner that no one seemed to meet it. But deep down, what was happening was more profound. She was afraid of repeating her mother's story, who had lost her freedom in a suffocating relationship, afraid of giving up her identity, afraid she wouldn't be herself if she entered a bond. During a reflective writing session, Elena realized something revealing. She had associated love with losing herself. In her field of perception, loving meant disappearing. And as long as that belief remained active, no relationship would be safe for her. That's when she began daily meditation with a simple intention. I can love without ceasing to be myself. Day after day, that phrase settled into her field, not as a forced affirmation, but as a slowly germinating seed. A year later, Elena began an unexpected relationship. It wasn't with the type of person she used to seek. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, loving, present, and for the first time, Elena felt free within a bond, not because her partner let her be, but because she gave herself that permission. She changed her field, and by doing so, changed her experience. The second case is Daniel's, a 36-year-old man who repeatedly lived the same story. He got emotionally involved, got hopeful, then disconnected. He always found a reason to end it. Something he didn't like. Something didn't fit. But deep down, he felt he didn't understand what was happening to him. Until one day, during a conversation with a friend, he heard the phrase, "What if you're not running away from them, but from what makes you feel vulnerable?" That question broke him. Daniel began exploring his emotions through therapy and guided meditations. He discovered that as a child, he had learned that being sensitive meant weakness, that showing emotions was dangerous. And that's why every time a relationship started to deepen, he felt like he was losing control, not because the other was a threat, but because love connected him to a part of himself he had repressed for years. Inspired by Grinberg's ideas, Daniel understood that his neuronal field had been structured to protect him from pain, but that same protection also kept him away from love. So he decided to progressively expose himself to intimacy, first by sharing his fears with friends. Then, in a new relationship, he spoke honestly about his tendency to escape, That transparency changed the bond. He no longer had to pretend. He could stay. And the most striking thing is that the relationship, far from trapping him, strengthened him. Because by letting go of the strong persona, Daniel could show himself as real. Mariana's case is different. She had always been a savior in her relationships. She got involved with emotionally unstable people, believing she could help them, transform them, heal them. For years, she repeated this pattern. Intense, chaotic, painful relationships. Each time shorter, each time more exhausting. Until one day, in the middle of a devastating breakup, a friend said to her, "When are you going to stop trying to save others and start saving yourself?" Mariana began doing deep work with visualization and writing. She identified that, in her childhood, her value had been tied to sacrifice. The more she gave, the more she believed she was worth. And that pattern became embedded in her field. She couldn't conceive of a relationship without suffering, because in her internal map, love meant total surrender, endurance, renunciation. Over time, and with much compassion, Mariana rewrote her story. She began cultivating deservingness. She learned to say no, to choose from calm, not from need. And one day, without looking for it, a person arrived who didn't need saving. Someone who looked at her as an equal, not as a caretaker. For the first time, Mariana felt seen, not for what she gave, but for who she was. These three cases are not exceptions. They reflect what happens when someone commits to their process, when they stop looking outward and begin to observe what's happening inside, when they understand that love is not something sought as an object, but created as an experience from an internal frequency. Grinberg believed in the power of testimony as a tool for expanding the collective field. He said that when a person shares their transformation, their story becomes information available to others. That is, hearing stories of healing, consciousness, emotional reconstruction is not just inspiring, it is transformative, because the listener's neuronal field resonates. It receives that vibration and begins unconsciously to generate new possibilities. That's why speaking is so important. Telling what's been lived, speaking the truth, not from drama, but from learning, not to stay in the past, but to use the past as a bridge to something greater. Everyone has their story, their time, their pace, but we can all recognize in these cases a mirror, a clue, an impulse, because at some point we've all been afraid. We've all repeated something we knew wasn't good for us. We've all felt like we don't fit, that we don't deserve, that this is how we are. But also, deep down, we all have the capacity to reconstruct how we look at life. No matter how many times you've felt broken, disappointed, misunderstood, if you choose to look inside, if you decide to change your field, everything can start again. It's not about erasing the past, but about giving it a different place. Not as an anchor, but as a root, because in every story there is a seed of transformation. You just have to be willing to water it with awareness, tenderness, truth. Transforming the field of perception is not a concept reserved for philosophical studies or expert meditators. It is a possible experience in daily life, in the intimate process of an ordinary person deciding to change their way of being in the world. And perhaps one of the most moving stories is Luis's, a 49-year-old man who repeated the same emotional pattern for over 2 decades. Intense, passionate, and deeply destructive relationships. Luis was the kind of person who always said, "I give my all in love." And it was true. He gave, committed, made huge sacrifices. But over time, all his bonds ended the same way. Pain, emotional exhaustion, and a sense of betrayal. He always felt undervalued, not chosen, left last. In his words, "It seems the more I love, the more they hurt me." After his 3rd divorce, Luis began therapy. It wasn't easy. At first, he only talked about the other, the women who left him, how unfair everything had been. But over time, he began to look inward, to notice that from a young age, he had associated love with sacrifice, that his father had been absent and his mother, though loving, lived in a constant state of emotional lack. Luis, unknowingly, had inherited that vibration. He believed loving meant losing, that whoever loved more suffered more. Upon discovering this, his field began to change. Louis started practicing visualizations and writing nightly phrases like, "Love can also be balance. I don't need to suffer to feel important." At first, he didn't believe them, but he persisted. He didn't seek a partner. He focused on redrawing his internal map. And when he finally met someone who treated him with tenderness and clarity, his first reaction was doubt. What if this is boring? Where's excitement? And there he understood. His field still associated love with drama, but now he had tools. He didn't run away. He stayed. And by staying, he discovered that love can also be peace. Another powerful story is Andrea's, a 29-year-old woman who thought for years she had bad luck in love. Relationships that never lasted more than a month. Frustrating dates. Emotionally unavailable men. But Andrea was not insecure. She had self-esteem, took care of herself, knew what she wanted. What was failing? The answer came the day someone casually asked her, "How did you feel when you saw your parents together for the first time?" Andrea fell silent. She had never thought about it. But when she inquired, she remembered her parents' divorce when she was 5. Her mother always repeated, "Men are selfish. Sooner or later, they'll let you down." That phrase had embedded itself in her unconscious as an absolute truth. And though Andrea never repeated it, she lived under its effect. Grinberg said that the neuronal field can be affected by inherited beliefs that were never questioned. Andrea was a clear example. Her field vibrated with distrust, even though her conscious mind sought love. That's why every time a relationship seemed to progress, something inside her triggered the alarm. She began to see flaws, imagine betrayals, doubt. It was not intuition. It was unresolved fear. Andrea began a process of emotional cleansing. She used symbolic cards, active meditations, and exercises confronting her story. She forgave her mother, not for what she said, but for having passed on what she herself suffered. And from that compassion, her field changed. Today, Andrea is in a stable and loving relationship. But beyond the bond, there is something she values even more: her inner freedom. The freedom to love without suspicion. The freedom to stay when something is good, without waiting for disaster. The third testimony is that of Julian, a reserved man, 38 years old, who always felt he was not material for a relationship. He didn't consider himself attractive, interesting, or fit for love. Since adolescence, he avoided emotional closeness. Every time someone got too close, he withdrew. He said he was someone difficult to love. That phrase accompanied him all his life. Until one day, in a body awareness workshop, something changed. During an exercise, the facilitator asked him to close his eyes and place his hands on his chest, and said to him, "Tell that part of you that always believed it is not enough, I see you." Julian cried. He didn't quite understand why, but something inside him broke. A barrier, a shield, a character. That night, he wrote a letter to his teenage self for the first time. He asked for forgiveness. He said he would no longer keep repeating that story, that he deserved love, that he deserved to be seen. That letter was the beginning of his awakening, not because someone immediately appeared, but because he began to inhabit his life with a different energy. He allowed himself to go out more. He spoke honestly. He stopped hiding his emotions. And without seeking it, love arrived, not to save him, but to walk by his side. These stories have something in common. They don't begin with the arrival of the other, but with the encounter with oneself. True change doesn't happen when the ideal partner appears, or the perfect moment, or the cosmic sign, or external approval, or loving redemption. Change happens when someone from their humanity says, "This is where I stopped this pattern. I don't want to repeat it anymore. I want to look. I want to understand. I want to free myself." Grinberg stated that the act of consciously seeing what was previously done automatically is the first step toward the expansion of being. And that is what these people did. They observed themselves. They felt discomfort. They confronted their own structures. And in that process, the field changed. And when the field changes, life changes. This doesn't mean they now live in a perfect state. Everyone still has hard days. Everyone is still learning. But now they have tools. Now they know they are not at the mercy of what happens outside. Their power lies in how they relate to what happens. Their freedom lies in their ability to choose again and again from awareness. And that is what we want to convey with these examples. That your story can also change. That your field can also be cleansed, ordered, expanded. That you too can stop repeating the same and start creating something new. Not from obligation, not from duty, but from the genuine desire to live with more truth. Change is not linear. Sometimes it hurts. Sometimes it confuses. Sometimes it seems it doesn't advance. But if there's commitment, consistency, self-love, the field responds. It always responds. Because awareness is contagious. And when someone transforms, they inevitably inspire others. That is the power of testimony, of the shared word, of vulnerability. So, if you have also experienced a transformation, however small, share it. Write it. Tell it. You don't know who it might touch. You don't know how many in silence are waiting for a story like yours to begin theirs. Every person who chooses to change is doing something much greater than healing their life. They are helping to elevate the collective field, to reconfigure the ways we love, relate, choose each other. That is why your inner work is not only yours. It is an act of service, a way to contribute to a world where relationships are more conscious, more truthful, more human. And you, are you ready to write your story? We reach the end of this journey. And maybe more than a conclusion, this is a pause to breathe, to let everything shared settle inside. Because if you have come this far, it is no coincidence. It's not just about having heard words. It's about having resonated with something. Having felt, even if just for a moment, that this content was also about you. Throughout this video, we unraveled layer by layer the reasons why a person, regardless of gender, age, or history, can remain alone for a long time. And we discover that the visible reasons, the ones the world quickly points out, are barely the surface. The depth lies in the perceptual field, in the way we have been programmed to see ourselves, to feel, to relate. The first great truth that emerged is that no one chooses loneliness for pleasure when what they long for is connection. And behind that apparent choice may lie invisible internal structures that shape the experience. Childhood wounds, family mandates, inherited beliefs, unresolved fears, unconscious loyalties, distorted concept about love, commitment, freedom, self-worth. Then, we went to the core of Jacobo Grinberg's thought, who with his liturgic model opened a new dimension of understanding. We do not live in an objective reality, but in a perceived reality filtered by our neuronal field, a field that not only responds to what happens to us, but constantly emits vibrations that affect what we attract, how we interpret it, and what we allow ourselves to hold. Grinberg taught us that wishing for something from the mind is not enough if the field still vibrates in distrust, lack, trauma, that we do not attract from desire, but from frequency, and that to change what we live, first we must change how we live it inside. Then we understood that it's not about desperately searching outside, but looking inward, that what we sometimes call bad luck or karma is nothing more than a pattern not yet seen, an unconscious choice repeated, a lesson not yet integrated. But we also learned that this field can be transformed, that we are not doomed to repeat the same, that emotional neuroplasticity, conscious observation, meditation, writing, forgiveness, visualization, presence, speaking truth aloud, all these are real tools that reconfigure our internal model and open us to new bonding possibilities. We saw real cases, true stories of people who, tired of repeating, decided to change their perception, their vibration, their way of loving. And in doing so, they not only found new relationships, but found themselves in a freer, more human, more connected version. And here we reach one of the most powerful conclusions. The partner is not an end. It is a mirror. It is a path. It is a reflection of the degree of consciousness from which we inhabit ourselves. Therefore, the true goal is not to stop being alone. It is to stop being internally divided. When that happens, love ceases to be a need and becomes a choice, an experience that adds, not completes. Now then, if at this moment you are alone, if you've been waiting, wishing, doubting for some time, I want to tell you something with total honesty. You are not broken. You are not late. You are not behind. You are exactly where you need to be if you are willing to look. Because transformation doesn't start when someone appears. It starts when you decide to stop hiding, stop protecting yourself with arguments, and begin to ask, what part of me is waiting to be recognized? Maybe it's your inner child. Maybe it's your wounded heart. Maybe it's your true voice, the one that never had space to speak. Whatever it is, if you choose to listen, something moves. And that small internal movement can change the course of a whole life. Love is not sought. It is cultivated. It is allowed. It is embodied. And for it to arrive, first you have to make space. Space in your mind to stop repeating old narratives. Space in your body to release past tensions. Space in your energy to receive a new frequency. Space in your life so that when the other arrives, they don't find closed doors. And if you're already in a relationship, but something doesn't flow, something hurts, something repeats, then the invitation is different. Don't look first at the other. Look at yourself. Ask yourself, from where am I loving? Am I projecting my wounds, or am I allowing the other to show me who I am without masks? Am I willing to stay even when my characters fall away? Because loving, truly, is letting yourself be transformed. It is surrendering to truth. It is stopping control and beginning to trust. It is choosing every day not the perfect, but the present, the honest, what vibrates with coherence. And that is what this video has wanted to convey to you. Not a formula, not a recipe, not a shortcut, but a deep invitation. Live from consciousness and let consciousness transform your way of loving. We know it is not easy. It hurts to let go of old mechanisms. It is scary to open up when one has been hurt. It's hard to trust after so many disappointments. But we also know it's worth it, because on the other side of fear there is no guarantee, but there's freedom. And the freedom to love without need, without guilt, without self-deception, without armor. That freedom has no price. If anything shared here resonated with you, if you felt that this story also belongs to you in some way, then now is the time to take action. Not outside, not yet, inside, within you, in what you decide to think, say, feel, and do from today onward. And if this content touched a chord in you, I invite you to leave your reflection in the comments. Tell us, what moment in this video moved you the most? What phrase will you take with you today? What pattern did you identify? Because when you speak your truth, you also help others recognize theirs. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, this is the best moment to do so, because we will continue sharing more content like this. Real, deep, courageous. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new episode. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone going through a moment of loneliness, confusion, or closure, share it, because you never know when a word can open a door that's been closed for years. Before we say goodbye, I want to remind you of something very important. Everything you feel is valid. The silence, the waiting, the anger, the nostalgia, the hope, the tiredness, the faith, all of it is part of the journey. And you are not failing by feeling this way. On the contrary, you are awakening. And awakening sometimes hurts, but it always frees. Today, you may still be without a partner. You may still be waiting for answers. But if this content moves something inside you, if it planted even a seed of awareness, then this video has already fulfilled its purpose. Because true love begins when one decides to live with an open soul, with a present heart, with a clear gaze. And if you have made it this far, if something in your field is opened, if something in your perception has shifted just a millimeter, then you are closer to that encounter you've been waiting for. Not because you are forcing it, but because you are no longer blocking it. So keep going, breathe, choose consciously, and above all, trust. Thank you for staying. Thank you for listening to yourself. Thank you for allowing this space to be a bridge. If you want to receive a special greeting in our next video, comment the word rebirth, because that is what happens when you decide to love from a new place. You don't start another story, you are reborn. See you very soon.